Hello, everybody, and good morning. Thank you so much for tuning into the show yet again. I'm here to tell you guys that it is about time that you follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen. I know y'all are out there listening and you're not subscribing and you're not following the show, and I don't like that kind of behavior. You guys know I'm tired of working these garbage jobs, wasting my time. The links are in the description of the show wherever you listen. All the links, all the social media links, all the different platforms. Wherever you listen, all I ask is to subscribe, to follow. Please, please, I'm begging you, subscribe, follow, and most importantly, enjoy today's episode. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you?
Dio, my friend, thank you for coming on. Thank you for reaching out.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's been a long time coming.
I know. I remember it's funny because we trained at Team United.
That's right.
Around a similar time, and we really sort of met each other while I was working at the bar.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Hey, both of the things that we need to blow some steam, I guess.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Before we get into your professional background, I did want to ask you about martial arts because I've been a martial artist since I was, 5 years old, since I was a kid. I'm 24 now. What kind of brought you into it? That always interests me.
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I'm older. I'm 39, and the reality is, I did some boxing way back when I was younger. And my father happened to be a boxer, and did some street fighting.
Yeah,
happens. We'll get to that a little bit afterwards. But one of my good friends, childhood friends, my best friend, Thomas Evans, and Mr. Captain America,
great guy.
and happened to be teaching, and my girls were interested in martial arts, so of course he's the first person I came to. As luck would have it, I got into it as well. I started doing some American Self-Defense camp out. That led to jiu-jitsu with our good friend, John Larkin.
Yes.
A little bit more allowed here and there, and before you know it, it's been, oh good Lord, I think 5 years now.
Wow.
Into training.
That's great.
So it's been an incredibly important part of my life.
Right.
It's a great outlet. Sometimes you'll find me there very late at night. Sometimes you'll find me there very at times, but it's been a fantastic tool to keep me going.
Right, and it is great that your children were involved in it because it is very much children are sponges, so it is a great thing to experience when you're young because then you can grow into it.
Absolutely, and it's also a fantastic conduit for discipline, and we that particular martial arts school that has been around for almost 13, 14 years. We've used it for a number of other things. So, given the fact that it is in such a community of need, we've now opened up an after-school program. As you know, everybody that goes there trains either half off or completely free, and this after-school program is no different. We have the things that we feel are necessary for just proper mental health and in childhood development. Have yoga and mindfulness on Mondays. We have music. We have acrobatics and dance. We have English and Spanish classes. We have a whole myriad of different disciplines that the kids can go in and just learn at their own pace and just enjoy. Because of the fact that, in today's world, we all need a little outlet.
Yes.
And of course, this is like everything else we do. This is also either free of charge or incredibly subsidized.
Right, which is phenomenal because one of the most detrimental things for kids is idle time spent doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing regardless of the age or obviously the scale of it changes the older you get, but to be able to impute that kind of discipline and that outlet, like you said, to be able to impute that at a young age so that you can grow and understand that as you get older it's also good to have an outlet and that passes on.
No, absolutely, and we've taken full advantage of that. I credit a lot of that to Tom Evans. He's been doing it for a long time. It's not until we combined forces that things really just kicked up and expanded significantly. Right. But incredibly proud to be part of that, and of course the inlet to that was martial arts.
Yeah. Now, you are a professor at Brown University. And like I said before we started this, I would prefer you do the justice of saying exactly what it is you do there, and then we'll get into how you got there.
Absolutely. So I'm an assistant professor of orthopaedics, formerly molecular pharmacology and physiology. My specialty is in the development of new drugs, primarily drugs from natural sources and infections. I work with the development of technologies that, for example, allow you to detect an infection a lot faster. Why the heck is that even important? Right? Consider that if you truly go into a hospital and look at the inner workings, you will see that, for example, it takes 14 days to truly diagnose an infection.
Sure.
Right? In the day and age where we have what we call multi-drug resistant pathogens, what the heck does that mean? It just means bacteria that are resistant to a massive amount of antibiotics. Consider that new antibiotics have not really been produced since the 90s. And even before that, we went the synthetic route, which didn't quite work out so well for us.
Why is that?
Well, consider that, for example, and I'll give you a nice little segue. One of my earliest discovery, was finding this new antibiotic that happened to be inside of a tunicate. It's just like a little sea creature that happened to be found in an underground volcano under Antarctica.
Okay.
Now, this is a heck of a reach, right?
Sure.
Right? And this particular single bacteria, which is one bacteria that we found in there, we managed to culture and propagate into trillions of bacteria. And this bacteria happened to produce this particular compound that we then sort of teased out little by little, identified, and it became one of the first antibiotics for what everybody now knows as MRSA.
The bacterial disease? Is that what it is?
That's the one.
That's it.
If you haven't gotten it, it's usually just a matter of time, especially for people like us that are in the gym at all times and rubbing skin with one another as we roll. So that happens to be part of that equation. So we as you know, a lot of those drugs were in the early days. Aspirin were all produced from natural sources, and they were unique molecules. At some point, the big companies decided, hey, we got chemists. Why don't we just change a little bit of that molecule? And now we have 13 new antibiotics with a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the work. Of course, bacteria are not dummies. They've been around, forever and ever for a reason. So they adapted mechanisms to overcome these new antibiotics. Like, hey, I recognize a lot of that molecule, but you sort of change an ear of it. So I still know who you are.
Sure.
So, of course, what happened is that we started having resistance mount up. That resistance carry over to the hospital. Once things are in the hospital, everybody's going to get them. If you want an infection, you go to a hospital.
Right.
Because that's what they are, right? So that trend continued. At some point, you sort of saw antibacterial everything. Good Lord, antibacterial toothpaste, hand soap, you named it. So this added to this pressure of bacteria to adapt. And they did. They did extremely well, extremely fast. So we eventually went on to what the World Health Organization calls the post-antibiotic age. And what that imagined was a time when there were no more antibiotics. Now, it sounds crazy, right? But the reality is that we, in a matter of 3 or 4 years, this is like 2012 to 2015, we went from, we have a gene that was discovered in a pig farm in China. And as you know, the farm industry utilizes a massive amount of antibiotics because they produce a lot of meat.
Sure.
And the animals are in close contact. So following that gene now to Europe and then Canada. And before we knew it, we had bacteria that were resistant to not only 1 or 2 antibiotics. Within 3 years of that, a female came to Las Vegas and had a bacteria in her, bacterial infection, that happened to be resistant to every single antibiotic that the CDC had in its arsenal.
Wow.
So we went from single resistance, multi-resistance, to now we call pan-resistance. These are bacteria that are, in essence, resistant to everything we got. They're death sentences. So it is my job to not only come up with faster way of diagnosing. You may not have 14 days if you have an infection. To faster way of diagnosing it, faster way to prevent the bacteria from adhering. Let's say you get a broken limb. It happens, right? And we have to go in there and fixate it, put rods, put plaques, et cetera, in there. So we have coatings. We have developed coatings that in essence act a force field. And these coatings prevent the bacteria from attaching. Once the bacteria attaches, we have a problem.
Right.
We all have a problem. You have to go back. We have to go back in there. We have to clean it up. We're gonna do a terrible job on it because you can't clean up everything perfectly, especially when it's inside of you.
Right.
And usually, what happens is recurrent infections. So we have these coatings that prevent that. Encourage the growth of new bone, literally right on top of that, and prevent the bacterial adherence. So we have focused on those two ends of things, while at the same time producing new antibiotics the way that we used to when they worked.
So now, is there a focus on creating antibiotics to combat these other bacteria that are resistant to all these antibiotics? Is that a little bit more of the focus?
In my lab, yes,
Okay.
but you'll be surprised that at the industrial level, this is not a concern because antibiotics don't make money, right? So in the time of Viagra, blockbuster drugs are the way to go, and an antibiotic that everybody needs, that you're gonna say, hey, if everybody needs it, it should probably be available for free or for very cheaply.
Sure.
Right? Companies don't quite deal with if it doesn't make money, it's not appealable. It's not. We're sort of we gotta please the investors.
Right. Now, are there a lot of, basically what I got from what you said is there's an emergence of these extremely resistant bacteria due to maybe the overcorrection, or maybe a overcorrection of antibiotics, like making these, like you had said, these products that are anti-bacteria and anti-everything. Is that kind of what forced this next step in the evolution of bacteria?
That is absolutely a fantastic take on it. Everybody knows triclosan. Triclosan is probably in the soap in your bathroom right now. So the FDA moved to ban it a few years ago, but the reality is that all of that takes time. You don't just get rid of 3 tons of compound A overnight. It goes somewhere. These companies don't just lose profits like that. It may not be in the U.S., but it's probably being sold somewhere in Bolivia. And so that's how that goes. So we're trying to, in essence, adapt. So something you learn from COVID is sort of, if you wait for it, it'll get you.
Sure.
Right? So we don't want that to come in and have us be completely unprepared. So one of the important parts of that is that I'm a kid that came from nothing, as you guys know. So I want to make sure that all of this that we are developing is also freely available and cheaply available to the common man.
Sure.
So that technology that I spoke about earlier about being able to detect the bacteria faster, which means you now get a much greater chance of survival, becomes an incredibly important tool. But if you can't afford it, I'm just sort of giving you a glass of water, from a TV when you're drowning in real life, right?
Right.
Doesn't quite help you. So we made this technology to actually be available for less than $1. And not only that, but we made it so that in essence what it does is that you have your body's immune system, and we've quote unquote hacked it with what we call a fluorophore. All this is just a molecule that fluoresces at a specific wavelength to a specific color, right? So that means I can have different bacteria glow in different color. Right? So I get rid of a lot of middle space in processing by literally saying, well, it's glowing red. That means you have this type of bacteria, which means you use this type of antibiotic, right? So that's how that particular technology works. And you may not say, well, we don't have an incredibly powerful microscope to detect it. Okay, do you have an UV light? Let's change that fluorophore to something that fluoresces in UV light.
Sure.
Right? Why? Because being knowledgeable of the hospitals, especially in third world countries or in the war theater or disaster areas, you may simply just have not a multi-billion-dollar building and facility, but you may just have a tent with a dirt floor.
Very
right?
true.
And congratulations, your risk of infection is going to go through the roof there.
Right.
Right? You can't sterilize the floor.
Yeah.
Right? So in those cases, you absolutely will not have a $500,000 microscope in there.
Right.
Right. But what you may have is a UV light. You can get it at $5 million. Right. So you can use that technology and be able to adapt it so that you can do that. Same goes for the coatings. There's a company called Sign Nails that essentially donates rods for fracture fixation. And, we even offer like, hey, we'll coat your rods for free so that people in these, part of the world can actually have a safe way of fixating a broken fracture.
So the rod that would be implemented to fix a broken bone or something is coated in an agent that would help detect bacteria?
The agent prevents the adherence of the bacteria.
Okay.
Right? So it's sort of divided into two questions. So like, okay, if I have an infection in there, can you detect it fast enough? If you have sepsis, you can die in 48 hours.
Sure.
Right? So can you detect my bacterial infection and can you detect my sepsis? Not in 14 days because I don't have that, but can you do it in 30 minutes? So the answer now is yes, we can.
Now you can, yeah.
Right? And the other part that we're all worried about, sometimes we don't even want to go to the doctors because it's so damn expensive,
right,
is can you do that cheaply so that I can afford it and I don't have to be homeless for a while so I can heal my body.
Right.
So we made all of these can be done in less than $1.
Now that's interesting because that's almost like a prevention mechanism.
Precisely. So you have the ability to diagnose it quickly.
Sure.
The faster you diagnose it, the faster you can do something about it because infections, as you know, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. Right?
Right.
So the other part about it is, can I just overcome all of this and not deal with it? Great. The best way to do that is just to prevent the infection in the first place. So instead of just putting in a random rod or a random plate or screws in you, why don't we just coat it in this solution? In 30 seconds, it'll be dry. It's literally nanometers thick. You'll never be able to see it.
Sure.
Right? And it goes right into your body. All it is just a form of silver. And silver has been utilized since the time of the pharaoh. Heck, it's in our food. It's silverware.
Right.
Right? That we have modified to be able to have, be safer and be released in a way that we can control it, which are two very important parts of it. Once again, very affordable, incredibly effective. The great thing about it is that because it's not an antibiotic, it can actually kill bacteria regardless of antibiotic resistance. So sort of going back earlier to this, post-antibiotic era, the best way to get rid of a problem is to circumvent the problem altogether.
Sure.
Keep producing antibiotics, the bacteria are going to keep doing what they've been doing. But if it's not antibiotic, all of a sudden the bacteria go, wait, what the heck is that?
Right.
So this particular compound, instead of antibiotics, kill bacteria in one way. This particular compound will kill them in about 8 different ways, all at the same time.
Wow.
So
it's like it really is. It's like a cure. It's like a much stronger substitute to an antibiotic. That's what it sounds like.
In a way it is.
Yeah.
In a way it is. But the take-home message here is that there's quite a bit happening behind closed doors of problems that we may not be aware of.
Sure.
To ensure that not only we are addressing it, but we're addressing it equitably for everybody.
Now, what's the process of getting this to market? Like, is it available already, or?
The coating itself is available actually in the form of a cleaner for prosthetic liners.
Okay.
One of the early needs that we saw was amputees, and wearing these liners in the heat, you're gonna sweat a lot. It's gonna scratch off against your leg. A lot of things are gonna happen. So that means the bacteria are gonna grow in there. So now you have an enclosed surface, and you're gonna get infection because you're rubbing on it, right? So we made it into this very easy to use sort of ampoule. You sort of break, shake, you apply, the end. During the early trials of this, we actually asked people to come back every week so that we can re-clean it and we can keep track of what's happening. At some point, people were not showing up for 9 weeks. And then they came back. I was like, what's going on? You're not going to believe this. My sores are gone. I've had these sores on for years. And my liner doesn't smell like death anymore. I was like, funny. So the technology not only exceeded our expectations, but exceeded the expectations of everybody else that was looking at it. And ultimately, we were able to gain penetrance into the market in that way.
Right.
Now, as you know, the FDA is a beast.
Sure.
Right. And one of the prohibiting factors for a lot of these technologies is the fact that I don't have $16 billion sitting at home. And neither do most people, and most companies don't want to do that. So right now we are attempting to show in as many ways as possible that the technology is effective, that it works, and we're literally doing this through clinical trials. Like, this is exactly the clinical problem. This is the technology in action. It's showing you what it can do.
Getting a big sample size.
Precisely.
Sure.
And that's essentially the best that we can do as single entities until somebody with really big pockets out there says, hey, that technology looks incredibly promising. We obviously see the need. We obviously see what it can do, and sort of move on from there. The same goes for the diagnostic, where we're showing that it works with clinical sample. I go into the OR, we get the tissue, we get the pieces of bones, we get the hardware, the synovium from somebody's knee, and we test it right on site. In essence, think about it like an X-ray. If you can have the ability to detect an infection in the same way that you can detect a fracture, right? So we can do that. We can just have a little piece of whatever it is, and I can beam you a three-dimensional image telling you exactly what bacteria you have in there, how many you have, and in 30 minutes, right on the screen.
Well, it would be an incredible misfortune if this technology didn't get picked up. And I'm sure you and your team aren't thinking like that at all. I'm sure you're thinking that this is an incredible product and you want it to happen. And I want it to happen. And I'm sure everybody listening wants it to happen because of how beneficial it is and how affordable it sounds. And, it would be crazy to not see this be something.
Yeah, we got to be optimistic. Negativity is everywhere.
Right.
And you can easily just say, well, it is what it is, move on, right? Yeah. Or you can get yourself into the usual, all right, next study, let's apply for grants and get that money. But the reality is that, the modern scientist has to contend with a lot more than just a science.
Right.
Of course, you always have the politics anywhere you go, but, money rules everything.
Right.
And the reality is that in these particular things, you sort of are also forced to wear, let me take off my lab coat and let me put on my business hat.
Yes.
So it's just a slow process because you're necessitating somebody, good Lord, I work about almost 100 hours a week every week. Oh, and then they now want me to go and try to sell technologies to angel funds.
Sure.
Right. And of course, at that point, the scientists get screwed. The doctors get screwed. So somebody says, well, you need the money. If I don't give you the money, this doesn't happen.
Sure.
As you just mentioned, I'm going to take 51% right off the bat. Right?
Brutal.
But that's just a reality, right?
It is.
So you have to contend with quite a bit of this. So the sad reality is that a lot of these promising technologies don't quite see the light of day because of the fact that, capitalism, blows. Capitalism is going to come for it. They see an opportunity, and sad reality is that, I may have been able to pull this off for $1, but if somebody says like $1,
yeah,
they're going to probably just boost that up to a heck of a lot more than that because they see a nice profit margin there.
Right. And then it's a question of ethics as the creator of it. It's like, do we want to see this exploited in a bad way, like hiked up prices and that type of thing?
Yeah, and for me, that's something that I think about very often because of the fact that, that it is very difficult to sort of, the way that I see it is in a way we're sort of reading the language of God, right? There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of tools that we have to sort of make before we even ask, these questions and even attempt to answer these questions.
Sure.
We live our world in a universe through a microscope. And even sometimes you can't even see that. So you're sort of looking at all these signals like the matrix that is always changing. The biological world is crazy. There's always something happening. And being able to decode some of these questions and then make it practically available to the common person is a hell of a challenge.
Right.
Right? Because you're sort of dealing with, at least 3 different factors in there that at some points you may not even be able to control either, but you sort of have to somehow, some way overcome it and then say, but if we do it this way, then we can make it available to, my grandparents, my aunt and so on. But it becomes a question of, do I rather want to see it, say, in my lab where nobody else will ever know or hear about it? Or do I want to, at the very least, say, okay, it's out there, then we can somehow, some way try to make it more affordable.
Sure.
We own the patents, no matter how you slice it. So it's really just a matter of, can we have a say, enough of a say to salvage it? But, that's a much different and much more difficult question to answer.
Right.
So we just can't control it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you had mentioned earlier you come from humble beginnings. You
yeah.
come from nothing, and I want to know how does. And you had even mentioned before we started, you come from another country, and how does a child who starts in that situation end up kind of here at the forefront of some groundbreaking technology?
Grit. I'm incredibly stubborn, and the reality is...
So that's a good thing. A lot of people say it's bad, but there's good parts to it.
And there's something that in there that, the drive can be, I say everything I ever learned that got me to this point, I learned from the streets. Sure. Right? And the reality is that, and I'm very open with my past. I'm a child of immigration. I'm an immigration orphan, as we're called. My parents immigrated to the U.S. when I was 6 years old and left me and a 4-year-old brother with extended family. And as you may imagine, a third world country, that essentially means you're alone. Sure. Right? So at 6 years old, I had to put on my big boy pants and get a job. So I took up a job.
At 6 years old?
At 6 years old.
Where do you get hired?
A slaughterhouse.
No.
Yeah. So one of the funny things is my father never taught me how to play baseball. Sure. My father taught me how to swing my fists and, dispatch animals. Right. Right. So that was something that I knew how to do very well. I had never taken down a cow. Right. Right. I had taken down goats, which my grandfather was a goat herder. Sure. And, you will see me around town at 5 o'clock in the afternoon every day, herding around 30 goats around town.
And this is where?
Dominican Republic.
Okay.
Right. And the funny thing is, so I come from a lovely place called the Devil's Mouth. And it sounds exactly like you may imagine. Sure. It was this nice, very crowded space where we had a nice 12-foot wall around our nice community with broken bottles on top and 2 very small doors.
Why was that? Why was it enclosed that way?
It's called the Devil's Mouth because once you go in, you kind of don't come out. Sure. Right. So I sit here, having survived at least 4 murder attempts, and you witness it all. You go through the rapes, you witness the rapes, you see the deaths, you see somebody get, hung against their will, down from the grapefruit tree that you'll eventually have to eat from, in a couple of days. You see somebody get chopped to death, stabbed, shot, dropped down a well, with cylinder blocks attached to them. So this all happened. So this is, I once upon a time I watched this movie called, I believe it was City of God. It's a Brazilian movie about a child in the favelas. And I said, good Lord, it does exist out there. Yeah. It wasn't just me. But as a 6-year-old, this is a lot to take in. And, not only as a 6-year-old I was alone, I had to take care of a 4-year-old kid. Sure. So I got that job. I had it for a while. I had it for at least, I want to say 2 years. And by then, you saw a, 3-foot-something kid that had a 24-inch machete on one side and a 12-inch stiletto on the other. Yeah. And that was in essence who I was. Later on, because death was a business there, and in the Devil's Mouth, business was good. Sure. I picked up a little side gig washing bodies before they got buried. So little, you got a table just like this, with what usually the family dining table. Yeah. A little bucket of water that you pull up from the well, and a rag, and you got to work. And
this was a funeral service, or this
no.
like...
Just remember, there was no funeral homes.
People getting killed.
This is people getting killed, and you would this would happen in their house. Wow. Right. So I had that little job for a little while, but ultimately one of the big challenges was feeding myself and feeding my brother. Sure. So there happened to be rivers and jungles sort of in the fringes of town, and my father was a fisherman. My father was a shoe cobbler that happened to fish. I should probably change that. And I knew this rivers like the back of my hand. And I would go there and catch fish, catch crabs, get whatever we can, get my little brother to carry some wood. We get back home, we start a fire, and that was dinner. And this was very, very often that we had to do that. Because if you didn't do that, then you didn't eat. You took a little can that you found on the river or so on, and congratulations, it's our pot. So That's in essence where I came from. I didn't see my parents for 5 years, and by the time they came back from the U.S., so in essence, a grown ass man at 11.
Right.
So I saw a lot, went through a lot. I'll leave the details, to between God and myself. But
sure,
it's something that taught me a lot. The reality is it was difficult, absolutely, but I learned a lot. You actually will hear people, say Dio's a little bit weird because, number one, he's always working. Like idle hands for me just don't do well.
Right.
And number two is you never see him stressed.
Right.
Well, it's kind of tough to get up to that level. I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
At age 11, once I sort of got out of that place, migrated to New York City.
Who'd you go with when you were 11?
So my mother actually, once we got our paperwork established, grabbed us on her birthday. It was her birthday present in the mid-90s, and moved on to 207th Street, completely new world. And I remember sort of asking myself, as we're driving from JFK into New York, my mom seems to be like with a, very long stare. She's like, "What's going on?" I'm just like, "Your streets are very wide." She says, "Yeah, it's just a 4-lane road, leaving the airport." It's like, "Yeah, that's troublesome." Mm-hmm. It's like, "What do you mean?" "Well, how the heck do you block those streets during a riot?"
You're
and
institutionalized.
She laughed, right? Yeah. Because what happened was, in the DR, you could go months without running water.
Sure.
So how did that get fixed? By riot. So you block the streets up with garbage, you light up tires on fire, and you have it out with the cops. And at some point, the mayor and so on will say, like, "Yeah, this is not a good look."
Right.
So they come and fix it, right? So in my mind, it was just like, good Lord, there's a lot of work to be able to block out that street. And she says, no, you don't have to worry about that here. We always have light. We always have electricity.
Wow.
And we always have light. I'm just like, get the fuck out of here.
Imagine that.
Like, you have electricity at all times. It doesn't go away for days.
Yeah.
And water. Like, whoa.
Yeah.
Your streets are actually paved. That's kind of blowing my mind. And
we don't have to threaten the mayor for water.
Hey, so we moved to 207th, and I, saw a lot, went through a lot there, but it was good Lord, you could get pizza anytime.
Yeah.
Those
anywhere was better than where you were, arguably,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was a massive shock, but I was like, you tell me that a truck comes around with ice cream in it? Good Lord, like this is like, and people complain about this.
Yeah.
This is my thinking, at 12 years old.
Right.
And my parents are assuring me that, this is a very, very different world. Like, this is safe.
Sure.
Right? You don't have to be, sort of standing. You see to this day, I never have my back to the door.
Right.
Right? You don't have to do that. Well, ironically enough, in one of those Hey Arnold summers, the fire hydrants are running. The kids are running up and down the street. Mr. Softy is coming down the street. Right. You can hear it. Fantastic summer day. And, we're cloud 9. When, all the kids are outside of the building, and my father says, "That's something like a silencer." And I look at my father, just like, "How can you hear a silencer? Like, that makes no sense." And he says nothing. And he just looks towards the corner. And before we know this SUV that sort of very gently just hits a stop sign. And everybody just looks. And a guy gets out of a yellow cab and takes an Uzi and sprays the living hell out of that SUV. And then, of course, runs down the street and just starts to shoot up all the witnesses on the side. And by the time he gets past us, and he's like, "I remember it, just like now." All you hear is just click, click, click. There was nothing left. And
this is when he was getting nearer to you?
Oh, yeah. No, it was right in front of me.
Yeah.
God, Lord, I remember seeing the barrel.
Right.
But by that time, a gun barrel to me was not a big deal.
Sure.
Been there, done that. I've been shot at, you name it.
Yeah.
And, we all sort of ran to this, towards this guy that was, got pulled out of the SUV, and a gentleman started doing CPR on him. But, all you saw was just blood coming out because it was all shut up. The gentleman didn't make it. And my father says, "Well, it's time to leave." So we happened to have an aunt that lived in Pawtucket at the time, and my father decided to put up a little grocery store right up the street from here on Douglas Ave, Los Primos Market. So eventually we moved to Central Falls, and we had this job. So when I was not in school, I was working up the street. Ironically enough, the first day that I came here, it was like 6:30 in the morning. My father sends me to that gas station, and I'm sort of just going up, like go get some coffee. And first thing I see this green car right by Chad Brown, and there's this gentleman sort of just sitting kind of like I'm sitting. Okay, it's an odd place to take a nap, but who am I to judge?
Yeah.
Right? And then as I'm sort of getting a little closer, I see there's blood dripping from his face. And then I just sort of look around and like, oh, there's a hole there. Of course, me being so desensitized at that moment, I literally just like, well, my father told me to get coffee, so I gotta get coffee.
Yeah.
So I kept walking, and when I got my coffee, and when I came back, I'm just like, oh, hey, Dad, by the way, there's a guy with a hole in his head in that car.
Yeah.
My father's like, what? So they all went. Of course, the guy was dead. And, I looked at my dad, and I was like, I thought you said we were moving to a different place.
Yeah.
We've moved to the same place. It's just different houses.
Sure.
Right? We went from tiny little wooden houses that you can literally break through with your fists to big brick buildings to something a little different here.
Yeah.
But in my world, in my head, nothing had really changed. I couldn't really just lay back and chill. So, of course, I later found out that we went to the poor, town, Central Falls. What the heck did I know?
Mm-hmm.
But poor for everybody else. And you got to remember that at this point, everything that I'm looking at is, good Lord, this is like rich people that I saw from in the TV.
Right.
So, when I wasn't working, I was, working on my schooling. Somehow, some way, had somebody there that saw in me something that I honestly did not see in myself. And, thanks to a lot of people and this particular guidance counselor that pulled me out of 7th period every single day so that I can, do my college essays that I had conveniently stocked up all the applications that she had given me over the last few months under my gym locker, right under my very, very stinky football gear. And, she pulled me out of class and she sat me down in this tiny little office and said, sit your butt down, start writing school essays. I was like, okay, can I ask a question though? What? What's an essay?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, let's start with that, right? So I started writing things, and in my head, I just knew that this is not something that it was realistic, right? Why? Because my parents at the time, I knew that they were both working 2 jobs, and they made under $16,000, together.
Sure.
Right? So the reality here is all of my friends go to the armed forces, and that's how they're able to afford it. That's how they are able to get out of town. So that's what I was doing. I had, through all my years, my dream was to be a pilot. So I have worked in the summers with little side gigs here and there. I didn't get paid for anything that I did for my family, right? That was to support the house.
Right.
You didn't even dare ask for allowances or anything like that. And I took flight lessons because that was my dream.
Sure.
Right. And
you wanted to be like a commercial pilot?
I actually wanted to be an Air Force pilot.
Oh, okay,
right?
okay.
And eventually, my dream was, because I used to remember seeing the airplanes, fly way the hell high up when I was a child. I was like, good Lord, like, they don't have to worry about any of this down
Sure.
here. And so that's what I wanted to do. So I did what every single child do. I had my recruiter. I had everything ready. And I remember the recruiter being at my house, and my mom showed up and like, okay, here's the guy. All you gotta do is sign. I was underage. And she kicked him out of the house. Not so nice way.
Yeah.
I just said, no, you're gonna go to college. It's just, how? Like, how? You guys, you guys are working 2 jobs each, so 4 jobs.
Right.
And you can't even break $20K. And, you'll figure it out. And of course, as life would have it, I got this bill from a university that will be unnamed, and it was it was around 24 G's, and that's the best that they could do. And I looked at my parents and was just like, "This is what I meant. do the math for me. I'm not that bright, but that doesn't quite jive. The response was, you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So once again, I sort of felt like you're kind of back on your own again. So you got to sort of pull from whatever the heck it is that you had, back then. Try to see if there's something in the basement, like Rocky says, and figure it out. So I eventually applied to every single freaking scholarship that was put in my face. I was lucky enough to get one, and that paid for all my schooling. And I found myself at URI on a free ride, busting my ass. And from there, of course, came the, okay, now you're graduating, now what?
Yeah.
And, it's one of those things where you're sort of going in bright-eyed, and I'm going to put my, my nose to the grindstone and do your work. But the reality is there's a lot that you don't know. And at some point, one of my mentors pulled me out and says, you don't belong here. I said, well, that's a weird way to start a conversation.
Yeah.
Like, you literally just need to leave. I was like, okay. Apparently they found out that URI wanted me to stay for grad school. And they made it very clear that they didn't want me there. So I said, okay. They're like, apply to Brown. And I laughed. Like, Brown?
Yeah.
Like, number one, I just found out what Brown was. Number two is, remember that I grew up in CF.
Right.
10 minutes on the street is Brown. We were not allowed to go past Shea.
Right.
That was the rule. You don't go past Shea. You don't belong there. Right? That's for rich people. By this point, I knew that I was not one of those.
Right.
And, I got a job. I applied, and then I completely put out of mind. Got a job at Amgen, made a name for myself there, and eventually I remember receiving this phone call, and I sort of get out of my office, and I go around, and it's somebody from Brown, or claiming to be from Brown, calling me, asking me to come over and, talk to them. And I said, no, thank you. I don't have time. And I hung up. They called me two more times. And stupid me didn't quite realize, like, you applied to that place.
Yeah.
This is an interview.
Sure.
They're asking for an interview. And I thought it was a prank call. I'm still sort of having that sense of denial. And finally, the head of the program calls me, like, Dio, just to be clear, this is who you're talking to, and we're calling you for an interview. And I'm like, oh, so this is happening. Like, how that happened, I don't know. So I remember telling myself, like, hey, just like, this is the first and last time you'll ever step on into this building. So enjoy and make the best of it. I put on, the best outfit that I own.
Yeah.
And of course, accompanied by my Timbs. And I walked myself up there. And I remember sitting myself in this table on this conference room with around 8 other prospects. And they're all discussing how this is their 8th or 9th interview, and they're discussing the plus and minuses of Princeton versus Yale, and so on. I'm just like, that's fantastic. I've heard of those places.
Yeah.
I haven't been to any of them. But, so eventually made a name for myself there, and got my PhD from Brown. One of the funny things that happened was, like, I asked my PI, I was just like, man, where's the rest of the people? He's like, what do you mean? I'm just like, the rest of us people. So I'm there for almost a year now. I had not seen another person of color.
Sure.
And he's like, oh, no. You're looking at him. And he laughed. It's like, and then he sort of paused and he's like, no, wait, there's one more. And as luck would have it, that one other person was passing. He's like, there he is.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh. So at that point, I decided to, I worked my butt off, and I asked, like, hey, have I earned my place to interview other folks? And I started interviewing other people of color that were applying to the program that might not necessarily have the perfect SATs, so on, but I knew where they were coming from. So you didn't just have to worry about school, you had to worry about work and making sure the mom was okay because maybe that dad wasn't around. And you had a lot of different challenges outside. So I changed the face of that program. This, of course, is looking at, they were, at that point, this is molecular pharmacology and physiology, or MPPV at the time. They only accepted about 2 or 3 people a year. This was probably the most selective program that Brown University had. And we changed the face because, of course, the only kids that were getting in there were the kids that had the means, that had already, interviewed in, 101, different top, tier schools.
Sure.
Eventually, I took another leap of faith, and decided to. This is 2012. And now I have a child, and I couldn't find a job to save my life. I had the best, education that money can buy. That money that I didn't have, of course, and somebody said, "Hey, there's a job in orthopaedics. You should apply." So I'm like, I know absolutely nothing about orthopaedics. And this lady sort of said the magical word. She said, "Well, you'll figure it out." And that got me. Like, that was just like, this is a
trigger word. Gotcha.
This is happening again, right?
Yeah.
Like, you'll figure it out. So almost out of spite, I said, you know what? I will figure it out. Another challenge my way, right? So then I took up the job, and it was this newly formed program, almost completely new. So I had the opportunity to actually, make it my own. Of course, that also meant that I had to convince the rest of the scientific field. As we know, scientists and doctors don't quite just take things on face value.
Sure.
That what I was working on was real, and of course, these are all technologies that nobody had thought about before, and I made it happen somehow, some way. Was offered a professorship, and now I'm co-director of that program, or that center, and the rest is history. So like here we are. How it happened, I really don't know.
Right.
I can't. I would love to tell you that it was a nice straight line, but
it never is.
It's
It rarely is.
I found myself absolute dead broke. I found myself owing a lot of money. I found myself, homeless. I found myself at the soup kitchen. I found, I've been there, done that. Because the reality is, none of this was supposed to happen.
There's something incredibly admirable, and there's something about growing up in incredibly declined environments, like environments where you're pretty much set up to fail. And there's something that 1% of the people that grow up in those places have this ability. It tempers them to, if they decide they're going to do something, they've already been hit with so much based on their environment in their early life that you telling them no, it's gonna go off the shoulders. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, yes.
That, which is, and it's an incredible advantage to have. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people wish they grew up as a trust fund kid. Some people would rather take the schooling you get from the street and from these impoverished environments. They'd rather switch that out for another way of living, one with more advantages. And typically those are the people who let the environment consume them, and they weren't able to find a way out. But there is something incredibly inspiring about people who come from these rough spots, some worse than others, but nonetheless, rough spots, and be that diamond in the rough that kind of makes things happen against all odds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mess. So from my perspective, it's my superpower, and let's just call it what it is. Was it easy? Absolutely not.
Right.
If I had the choice, would I go through all of that? Absolutely not. I've had to pull my little brother, who barely knew what the heck life was, out of the line of fire of some drunk dude that got his ass kicked and was embarrassed that kids saw him get his ass kicked, right? And sort of just look down the barrel of a 38 and move out of the way before he shot. And then I beat the living shit out of him as a 10-year-old kid, right? And one of the funny things that happen when you're in that world for so long, and somehow, someway you're alive after a certain amount of time.
Sure.
And the reality is, I would probably tell you, there's probably around 16, 17 kids, that were in the same exact position that I was. And out of those 16, 17, I think there's 2 of us left. And, the reality is that in that world, it swallowed you whole. And in many cases, they'll never find you. A lot of things happen on that river when we're trying to get food and bathe.
Sure.
A lot of things happen when, 7 o'clock came down and, those metal gates closed. And, oh, shoot, you didn't make it out on time. So what do? At that point, it's like, well, buddy, you should run and try to see how high you jump if you can make that.
Yeah.
Pretend that the glass is not up there. You're going to get cut. Like, make peace with that. You're going to get freaking cut.
Yeah.
But those guys up there are looking at the fact that, number one, you have shoes. If you look down, I don't have any.
Right.
Right? And you're their size.
Yeah.
More or less. So things are not going to go well for you. So they can cut you or you can cut yourself.
Yeah.
Right? So, let's see how good your high jump is. You can either go up, through the barbed wires, or you can go and see if you can clear a 12-foot wall. But that was the sad reality of living in that place. But in essence, it's all about perspective, right? At that moment in time, that's all I knew. So that's my world. At this given time, heck, I'm away from Douglas Ave. Kind of grew up there in Rhode Island. I saw a dead body down there.
Yeah.
Right? So it's all relative. So you want to be able to encapsulate inside of your mentality to the task at hand. And the fact that I've been blessed, and I'll say very clear that I've been blessed to have sort of traversed such a long road to where I am now, has given me the ability to really just understand, what the real world is. I may just be able to pack up and move on to more affluent areas.
Sure.
Right? But the fact that we didn't do that, now with COVID, for example, you didn't really see that many doctors out there on the streets, in the towns, where people were suffering. Nor did you see anybody say anything about whether or not these policies that have been written at the state level, at the national level, did they take under advantage the fact that a real person may not necessarily have a wing of their house to quarantine?
Sure.
So when COVID broke, I just happened to be lucky enough that I actually started tracking it almost from day one, completely by happenstance. One of my friends played this game called Plague Inc. And he said, "Dio, you would be great at this game. It has, pathogens and pandemics and so on. And hey, you know a lot about that stuff." Started looking, through it, like, hey, this is pretty fun. Right? And then I do what I always do, and I look at the WHO depository, and there was this kind of weird thing called coronavirus in there. And I started following, and believe it or not, I started playing around. Okay, this is something new. If I were to spread this throughout the world, how would I do it? Again, modeling after a game.
Sure.
And as to what happened, I will say, hey, it's going to come through the West Coast, and it's going to come through, the California, Seattle area, and it's going to come to the port of New York. Right? As luck would have it, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Then I started modeling how at the time, how our social status was. And, hey, if you tell people quarantine for 2 weeks, you're going to have armed uprisings.
Right.
And, of course, that's exactly what we had. And then, of course, came the diagnostics. That technology that I mentioned earlier that can diagnose bacterial infection in 30 minutes was the first technology that was actually pitched to be able to detect COVID. Within 3 or 4 days, I actually completely turned it around and say this can now detect COVID based on the previous variant of the coronavirus that had been discovered a number of years ago.
And it was able to do it just as quick?
It was able to 30 minutes.
Wow.
And once so that didn't get funded, believe it or not. So actually never manifested in that fashion. But what I was able to do was, at that moment, I knew folks throughout Rhode Island, the Department of Health, and different entities. So I said, we need to make sure that our people get taken care of. And especially when you had a very new developing situation and you had no people that actually knew the hood at the table. So what was happening is that the policies that were being written were not equitable for the normal person. And also the fact that, the information was changing very quickly, still is, right? So how do you now take incredibly high level scientific and medical information and communicate it to mom or dad who probably had third grade reading level from another country in another language?
Sure.
Right? Or how do you tell somebody go quarantine for, 14 days in a house in Central Falls where there may be 8 people living in a 500 square foot apartment?
Sure.
And I made a joke, and it wasn't really a joke. It was a fairly pointed comment at a colleague that mentioned that, and I literally said, "I'm sorry. What side of the bathtub would you like them to quarantine in?" Right?
Sure.
And they said, like, "What do you mean?"
It's a reality.
Like, you have 8 or 9 people living in these apartments. Like
Right.
that's just a sad reality there. That may not be your reality, but there's 70,000 people in Pawtucket. There's about 20,000 people in Central Falls.
Yeah.
And that's gonna be a problem. And as we know, Central Falls at some point was the highest per capita positivity rate in the world. So we went to work. You saw me out there talking to people and explaining what was happening. You saw me at Payne Park. You saw me at Southside. Talking to people face to face. Giving them the information as I knew it, and I had done my due diligence of keeping up with the data every single day. I had 2 phones, and they never stopped going. But I went out there. I modeled the message to be able to be understood to the common man. To me, it kind of honestly pissed me off, the fact that if I wasn't on that in that conversation, a lot of people would have gotten left behind.
Sure.
So the fact that I had all of these experiences throughout my life really shaped all of this, because at the end of the day, I'm going to look out for the people that I know need it. And the reality is that's the vast majority of the people in this world.
Right.
So that's what, fuels my passion, and, just my desire to continue to bring the world up from the bottom. I have absolutely no interest in lining somebody's pocket that is already fairly well lined.
Right.
My goal is to essentially be able to take care of the people that need to be taken care of.
Now, you had mentioned, and this is a point that's been brought up before and kind of more recently, is that there weren't many doctors out in the field willing to treat people who had COVID. Obviously because of the lack of information and how quickly things were changing and how often that was. But it is an interesting point to bring up because, again, obviously you have a lot broader understanding of pandemics and how they've been handled in the past and that type of thing. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like throughout most of everyday life, a doctor would never recommend you to not show up for treatment until your oxygen levels are so low that you're gasping, which, is kind of a rough interpretation of what the CDC was recommending at one point. So it is interesting that was kind of the, I guess, plan of attack or mode of attack when it came to COVID treatment.
Yeah, so you also have to realize from the doctor's perspective is the hospitals were buzzing.
Sure.
Right, and I don't think most people realized just how busy things were. We're talking about 18-hour waits in the waiting room. We have people coding out in the waiting room. And the reality is, for somebody like me, I'm a researcher, number one. I'm a PhD, so I'm not allowed to treat anybody. Do I know the treatments? Absolutely.
Right.
But I'm not licensed to treat anybody. What I could do, though, is to take all of that information that I know extremely well and be able to break it down to common language and talk to people, like people, right? Not talk to them as in, yeah, this is what's happening, take it or leave it, bye. No, I'm going to take my time and talk to you.
Right.
The other part about that is it was a massive sacrifice. I averaged 106 hours a week for 20 months straight. I got paid for none of this, right? But I still had a job that I had to do at the hospital.
Right.
I had my job through the university that I still had to do. And I was out there, food drives, bringing the Elisha Project out there to make sure that people had something to eat. Because a common person cannot take 2 weeks off of work.
Right.
Right. Just 2 weeks to flatten the curve, great, so long as my people are fed. And their bills are paid.
Right.
We're living, like I said, $16,000 from 4 jobs a year with 2 kids, 3 kids actually at that time. And I just knew what had to be done, and at that moment, I really didn't care if 40 of my colleagues were going to show up. It was really just about what I could do at that moment, and that's what I did. The reality is that I don't blame physicians that didn't have the time, because the reality is that I was trying to protect a lot of people out there, but I was not home.
Sure.
And I have a family, and I have 2 girls, and I have a wife, right? But both my parents are disabled, and so I was trying to take care of things out there to prevent them from coming home, and that was my way of protecting my family because I was not home.
Right.
Right. I was at vaccination clinics all day, literally hopping from one to the other. Right. I was at testing sites and literally just hopping from one thing to the other, and that's what I was doing. Then I would go into the lab and I would do work. So that was a massive sacrifice top to bottom. It's just a sad reality of it. And of course, this was also happening, in my place of birth. So between March of 2020 and probably around June of 2020, I lost 16 family members. While all this is happening, you have me on my phone on the other side watching the old cemetery that I used to frequent very often with my family members being stuffed in there, 2 in a coffin. We have coffin shortages. Right. And people didn't quite realize that this could be a possibility until the refrigeration trucks started showing up behind the hospitals and behind the different buildings. So I was dealing with all of that at the same time. Like I said, when I say it was a massive undertaking, it was, but got done. Yeah. And that's all I care about.
And it was worth it. Yeah. Getting the help out to like you said, the common man. And it's unfortunate that, like we had mentioned earlier, speaking about capitalism, that the funding is obviously more geared toward bottom lines and paychecks rather than helping people. Not all of them, but some of them are. And, it takes strong and courageous people like yourself and your team that are willing to go out there and educate the, like you said, the common person, the simpler person, the person that doesn't have that extra wing in their house. And how can we help them be just as safe as those other people? And how can we help them prevent sickness and prevent this, this pandemic infectious disease from scourging through them as well? Because they have the same rights that any other person that was born in whatever that country happens to be deserves. So.
Absolutely, and at the end of the day, like even when I'm incredibly active on the education front,
right?
Especially in these towns that are not as wealthy as the other ones, particularly because each and every single one of those kids is me 20 years ago.
Sure.
Right, and I see myself in them. The only fantastic difference between me, back then and them now is that they're a lot brighter than I ever was. Right, so that gives me a lot of hope. The one thing that I want to make sure happens is that these much brighter deals, do have a far better shot at succeeding than I did, because the fact is that the world needs divergence of thought, especially in the medical and scientific fields. And they also need humanity. And this is where it comes from. It takes somebody that knows what it's like to be able to fight for that.
Sure.
Right? You can always just show up and say, oh yeah, diversity is a huge problem, top to bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a 30-minute course on diversity and I'm going to be a diversity expert. Well, this is a sad reality. It happens, right?
Yeah.
But it takes a lot more for somebody who says, well, I'm from Central Falls, right? And I migrated from Honduras,
Yeah.
so on, and I had to work through college, and I still support my parents, and this is happening, and I'm here, right? That's a heck of a different candidate than I'm a 4th-generation MD.
Yeah.
And my grandparent, my mother, my father, my uncles all donate to University XYZ, right? So your path is already you are already a doctor before you stepped in here.
Sure.
So now if you give me a child that says, well, I didn't want to say anything, but I don't have money to eat, and my parents back home are homeless, but I have to think about that and I have to deal with all that, and then somehow, some way, I got to block that out so that I can get my straight A so that I can be a doctor.
Sure.
That's a hell of an undertaking, So I've made it my job to make sure that in my lab we take all of these kids, right? So it's one thing to be able to go on the media and say, we are giving out free scholarships to all of these kids in need. Great, great, great. Fantastic, amazing, right? What happens to those kids once they're on campus? And they come in and they're like, I don't belong here.
Sure.
Their deal, like, where is everybody else, right? And, I don't come to school in a Ferrari, right? No, I am not a prince, right? So where's the support for those kids? And where's the guidance, the mentorship for them to be able to be successful once they are in these institutions that are not built for them?
Right.
So in my lab, we've been absolutely lucky enough that we've taken these kids. And, most people will take 1 or 2 a year. I have 20 right now. Of course, it's a massive amount of work, but out of those 20, I've been doing this for now, good Lord, 17 years. I've been around. And in those 17 years, I've trained more than 300 doctors that would have otherwise not been doctors.
Sure.
Had they not had that mentorship. Of course, that has absolutely nothing to do with me. That has everything to do with them. Because all they needed was a fair shot.
Right.
Right.
But you gave that to them.
Me and a lot of other people.
Right.
Right. I am just one.
Right.
And the great reality is, even to this day, my lab is either majority female, which in orthopaedics you never see it.
Yeah.
You actually probably get one or two residents every few years that are female, and we have an average of 8 nationalities a year. Right. And that's a huge thing. Like, I'm the only person of color. I'm the only faculty of color in my entire department. And I keep finding myself in these situations, and I don't see it changing.
Right.
But the reality is that, if you see somebody that knows that looks like you, and you see somebody that knows what you've been through, all of a sudden you're a lot more comfortable in saying, "Hey, can we talk?
Yeah.
This is the problem that I'm having now.
Right.
Right? Can you just give me 5 minutes of your time?" The reality is, those kids that are like, "Yeah, absolutely, we'll talk."
Yeah.
They never leave. Right? And I don't want them to leave, because for once, I had the opportunity to now help another.
Right.
And the reality is, this is why I'm still in academia.
Yeah, I mean, representation is huge. I had a little while ago, I had my old football coach who used to be a detective in Providence. I had him on the show, and he had mentioned that because of where he came from, he had a specific skill set that not some of the other officers had. Like, he came from the hood, so he understands when a situation is happening, when to use force, when not to use force, kind of able to read the room. Whereas if you get an officer who grew up in a more gentrified suburban area, they have a little more of a hair trigger. That could mean a couple different things, but they're a little more on edge. They don't know how to treat the situation. When this person could just be intoxicated or under the influence of a narcotic or something, and could be responded with a different type of force rather than deadly force. So it is important to have representation, because wherever you come from, regardless of how bad or how good, there is positives from that. And those people can teach the other side those different aspects of that life.
Yeah, and it's I actually do appreciate you bringing up sort of that skill set and being able to sort of read the situation. That's probably what kept me alive through all these years. Just the ability to sort of be in the middle of a jungle with a bubbling brook, and being able to know exactly how many people were there.
Right.
And know if there was danger in the air. You could smell that. That kept me alive. That kept me and my brother alive, and a lot of other kids. And I don't know if I can't do that nowadays. I don't have those instincts anymore.
Yeah.
But at the very least, what I do have is sort of that experience. Those things you don't forget. It's sort of every once in a while, I sort of think of myself as sort of like that crash derby car that somehow, some way, still able to pull out of the of the field and go home.
Yeah.
But I quite like it that way.
Yeah.
Right. You never hear anybody, such John Larkin, who keeps referring to me as Dr. Dio. You would never know what the heck it is I do for a living.
Sure.
And I like that.
Right.
We can have the conversation as people. We can. None of my students there call me doctor.
Right.
I'm Dio. Let's that's what I do for a living. That's a title. That doesn't define me. But let's just have a conversation eye to eye. I'm going to treat you like a person. You're trying to treat me like a person. You have a problem, tell me, we'll solve it. I have a problem, I'll tell you, we'll solve it.
Right.
And that's sort of my philosophy, throughout what we're doing. At the end of the day, if I can leave the world a little bit better than I found it, I've done my job.
Right. Yeah, that's very cool, motherfucker, Dio.
At
least I think so.
I appreciate that, but the reality is just, I'm just a person that cares for people.
Right.
That's a lot of the opposite. We can sit here for hours and hours and hours, and I can tell you sad stories and so on. But instead of doing that, I can tell you what I've learned from those stories, and I'm still here.
Right.
A lot of people have benefited from whatever the heck choices I made way back when.
Yeah.
Just maybe me beating up a 40-year-old drunkard with a machete and whatever, may not have benefited somebody now, but hey, it kept me alive. It kept me alive back then.
Yeah.
And hey, at the end of the day, the reality is this. The world is going to keep changing. The gap between the poor and the rich is going to keep expanding. And we see that every single day. Privilege is very real.
Yes.
And I can tell you with a guilty face that yes, if I take off this hoodie and I put on something else, that the privilege can be worn. But I very much like this hoodie.
Right.
And the reality is that I'm a kid from the hood. I came from nothing, and the blue collar, you may not see it all the time, but it stays there.
Right.
At the end of the day is, I find a lot more joy for my soul from helping somebody than I do from a paycheck. Money doesn't mean shit for me anymore. And that doesn't mean that, okay, money doesn't mean shit because you may have some. Like I said, I've had none at many points. And the reason why money doesn't mean shit to me is like money is just a means to get me to be in this position where I can have a voice.
Right.
Where a politician can, say, well, let's invite him. He's good for a donation. Well, great, I'm good for a donation, but I'm good for a few words though.
Right.
And the reality is, the words also carry accountability because you'll see me again.
Right.
So that's in essence who I am. And at the end of the day is, I may have bad days, dealing with all of these things, but I have a fantastic family at Team United that will allow me to roll and get choked out a few times and, forget about things, after a few blows to the head.
Yeah.
But, I'm just a normal dude that just happens to have a job that is a little bit atypical.
Right.
The rest is just details.
To be fair, a 10-year-old you is probably a little bit, is probably tough to handle for a drunk guy.
I could not take a 10, 11-year-old me anymore. But once again, that's what happens when you cage an animal, and that animal has a will to survive.
Exactly.
Maybe not so much for myself, but because I did have a 4-year-old brother, a brother that was 2 years younger than me.
Sure.
That's when I was 8 that I had to take care of. So on my own, it probably wouldn't have been here.
Yeah.
But the fact that I had somebody else depending on me, and you'll see there's a common trend in the underline there.
Yes.
I'm a papa bear. I take care of others. That's sort of like what I do.
Right.
No matter where I go. And hey, yes, that happened. I'm glad that I had to be the one to bear that cross and not somebody else.
Right.
And at the end of the day, hell, whether you're in the devil's mouth of, Tenadas, Dominican Republic, or whether you're in Central Falls, or, Inwood, or, the Heights, or hell, we're in PVD now, it's all relative.
Right.
We're all dealing with our shit in one way or the other. The reality is that if you're a common person, you're going to be dealing with not having money. You're going to be dealing with figuring out where the heck your next meal is going to come from.
Right.
Can you keep the lights on? Can you keep the water on, or the gas? Can you pick? That's all reality. So I am absolutely no different. The setting was different, sure.
Sure.
But I my story is the story of every single person that I come through on a daily basis. Hell, you probably have some very similar stories, somewhere in there. My story is absolutely no different.
Right.
I'm just a person that maybe went through a little bit more than my fair share.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm happy to have taken and continue to take on that lion's share of whatever pain and suffering life has to take my way. At the end of the day, I'm glad it's me, not somebody else.
Sure. Now, before we wrap this up, let everybody know kind of what you're working on at the moment, what you're working on currently, if it's any different than what we've talked about up to this point.
Absolutely. So right now, I'm definitely trying to make sure that whatever remainders of the COVID pandemic we are facing on at the moment. Of course, we got to understand that this is dynamic. Don't continue to affect the poor inequitably. And the other part that we're working on that's probably a little bit more exciting is the technologies that I mentioned earlier have now started to evolve a little bit more to the point where we are now able to also detect traces of sepsis in your system. As you know, a few years ago, Rhode Island didn't have a protocol for sepsis, but sepsis can kill you in 48 hours.
Sure.
And it's very difficult to detect. So we can detect it very readily now through that same technology in the same single step, no added steps to it. And we can also detect something called biofilms, which is what happens when bacteria, as I mentioned earlier, adhere to those surfaces, and you can't get rid of those infections no matter what it is. So we can detect that, and subsequently, using that same technology, we've developed irrigants or solutions that you can literally wash off the wounds with that can get rid of them. So these technologies are all very real, and again, made them for a few bucks.
Sure.
So real and affordable, and certainly breakthrough. And hopefully they do make the light of day, and they do make the light of day as unharmed as possible. And yeah, it's just incredibly exciting for me to just see something that was thought of a decade ago, sort of take wings and be real.
One other question I wanted to ask you about is a lot of this technology based on cell signaling, and do you find that if somebody who has like a degenerative disease, does that affect the treatment's ability?
Yeah, so the cell is the technology, at least the diagnostic technology, those utilize antibodies. It's the antibodies that you have in your body, and all we do is we modify them so that we can attach that signaling molecule to it.
Sure.
One of the great things about it, and I'm glad you sort of bring that up, is with regards to Alzheimer's. So one of the prevalent theories now is that Alzheimer's is a result of a prior infection in your brain, and a subsequent immune reaction that has created these plaques that will continue to impede your neurological activity. The funny thing about that is that the prevailing theory is that one of the molecules responsible for doing that is called endotoxin. The great thing about the technology that I just mentioned is that the way that we detect a certain type of bacteria is through the detection of a molecule called lipopolysaccharide that once you break the bacteria, once the bacteria dies, becomes endotoxin, which causes the sepsis, which may be the molecule that eventually leads to Alzheimer's. So the great thing about it is that we can detect that very quickly. Although my PhD is in neuropharmacology, I am no longer active on the neuronal research side of things.
Sure.
But this is something that we're very aware of, that, hey, we can detect endotoxin. Then it begs the question, can we detect Alzheimer's or pre-Alzheimer's in 30 minutes with just a small sample of maybe your cerebrospinal fluid?
Wow.
So this is something that we absolutely have thought about. And the great thing is, just remember, you can take a piece of tissue that is absolutely tiny. You can take a piece of fluid that is a tenth the volume of a tear, and we can do it.
Yeah.
Right on the spot.
Well, Dio, my friend, the work you're doing is incredible, and I'm happy we had this conversation so that I could really get the scope and the magnitude of what you're doing. And it is incredible, and I am very happy that you reached out and we were able to do this, and I hope a lot of people listen to it.
And I appreciate it, and thanks so much for having me. Ultimately, I definitely want to just have this conversation, not so much because of what I've been doing, but if there's some kids out there that are listening that say, hey, there's no way that I can move beyond, the hood or whatever it is that I'm at now.
That's right.
Hey, I by the time I got to the hood, I had traveled quite a bit.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day is get yourself a supporting crew, get yourself, a nice pair of jogging shoes and get yourself going, put yourself up by your own bootstraps and make it happen.
Yeah.
I'm living proof that there is, that there is room for people that came from nothing to say something. So here we are.
Right. And where can people find you if you want people to find you?
Hey, I'm very easy.
Yeah.
My 11-year-old recently started Googling me, and then she just recently realized what Daddy does for a living.
Right.
So that's been interesting. But hey, I'm you can find me through Brown University. You can find me through Rhode Island Hospital. Just a simple Google search. I'm always around.
Yeah.
And if anybody needs help, I'm always willing to help.
There you go, people. We're done. Thank you so much for listening. Follow the show wherever you listen. Follow the social media links. We're done, people. Peace.
All right. Later.